In this first video, we're going to talk through the process of the underpainting. And in the second video, we'll look at laying the painting over it, the overpainting part of this. So right now, what we want to do is create a nice even layer using the mid-tone of whatever color palette we're using. So the first leaf, we're going to go ahead and leave blank as sort of a negative control of what it looks like when we don't utilize an underpigment layer. The second one is going to be a gray. So this is a monochromatic style, and it's called grisaille. So we're trying to use a nice, even application. We want to make sure that it's fairly heavy and that we're creating a very opaque layer, but we want to make sure that we're not incorporating too many brush strokes. We're also making sure that we're not sort of really blending in the paint as we go. And it's not obvious in our first application, but you'll see as we lay painting over, we're just really trying to lay this down. We're just interested in color tonality. We're not super obsessed with painting in the lines or creating a super even base. So we're just trying to get blocks of color onto our page. So our next color is going to use a nice ochre yellow to create the effect. So this is going to really add a lot of warmth to this particular painting, which you'll be able to see later after you've added the glaze. So our yellow technique is referred to as verdaccio. And so once again, we're just really interested in getting a relatively heavy layer of yellow in, but we're not obsessing too much about our applications or any of that. So as we're moving on from shape to shape, we're giving our previous layers a chance to dry. This is another really important feature of this technique. We don't want to do too much blending. We want to leave things pretty bold. So as a contrast to our yellow underpainting, we're going to look at a blue as well and see what that does for the color tone of our final piece. So again, we're just laying down our base color, keeping it fairly opaque. Okay, now that we've gone in and laid down our mid-tone for all of our shapes, we're going to come back in with our dark color. So for our grays, we're going to be using black. This is a nice monochromatic underpainting. We're laying it here in all of the places where we would expect to see shadows cast. So we're thinking about a sort of overhead lighting. We're providing our low lights to the underside of our leaves and underneath the veins, into the recesses between our flowers where they overlap, or leaves where they overlap. So just keeping it a really nice, simple, blocky low light, not worried about blending here at all. Coming back in on our yellow, we're using a nice warm brown as our low light. And again, we're thinking about the areas that are going to be cast into shadow, dropping in our low light or between our leaves, creating a nice high contrast mid-tone versus dark tone. And that's going to be the real key to this technique, is creating high contrast, high pigment blocks of light and dark. Coming in our blue, we're using a nice dark blue So again, staying within the same color family to create our contrast. Underside of our vines. Leaves cast in shadow. Area between the leaves. And again, this is a speed painting technique. We are not interested in a highly refined final product right now. Just trying it out. Alright, so we've given some time for things to dry between our layers, and so we can come back in with our highlights. And most of the time your highlights are going to be a really nice bright white, as we're using here with the Griselle. You can also use yellows or oranges. It depends on what it is that you're looking for. But it's really hard to go wrong with a strong application of white in this technique. Since I've got white on my brush, I'm skipping ahead to the blue because I'm going to go back and use yellow on our yellow palettes. And here I'm really paying attention to the edges, using the white to clearly define the edges of the leaves and really bring that out. So this will give you a chance to see what it looks like with a bright yellow as my highlight color. But if I were to come back, in hindsight, I probably would also hit the very edges with white to create a final, very bright effect. It's quite striking. All right, moving on to our faces. So I've got 4 faces drawn out, and I'm gonna, do each one with a different color palette. So here we're using ruddy browns, reddish browns as our background. And again, you're gonna start off with your mid-tone, and you're just filling in. Again, we're just doing this very rapidly, just trying to get a nice opaque layer of our underpaint. Now I forget to do it here, but don't forget to fill in your neck or that left ear if you're following along. Alright, so we've let this dry for a little bit, and I'll be coming back in with the dark tones. So we're thinking about the places where shadow is going to be cast on faces. And if you're not sure what this looks like, you can't go wrong with headed to YouTube and watching a makeup contouring video. But what you're going to notice is that the shadows of the faces tend to be around the eyes. It's going to follow along the edge of the nose. It's going to be under the cheekbones. The placement is going to depend on the cheekbone. It's going to follow the edge of the jaw, and it's going to follow into the temples just a tiny bit. Depending on, what you're trying to emphasize, facial expression-wise or age, you might also add some lowlights around the mouth. And then when we're thinking about our highlights, you're going to be wanting to build up the nose, the forehead, a little bit underneath the nose for the sort of bow of the mouth, your chin, and definitely the cheeks. And you know, I've added orange as sort of a primary highlight, and now I'm coming back with white to add very strong highlights. So again, you want high contrast for this method. We'll blend it out later. Don't worry about it. So I'm coming back and adding a little bit of shape underneath the nose where I've painted over, but not too bad. I will come back and add more cleanness to the face as I go along. So starting on the second face, in this case I'm using actually a monochromatic black and white effect, so something a little different here. Again, really making sure that you're filling in your midtones to create a nice opaque background to work against. However you choose to do that, don't be like me, remember your necks. So when we come back to do the low lighting, again, we're going to be targeting between the eyebrow and the eye. We're going to be following the nose. We're going to be following the jawline, highlighting the ears, and underneath the cheekbones. So here, I'm really taking the opportunity to highlight the nose, which is a very prominent feature on this individual. And as you will notice from the video break, I had to wait a little bit to make sure my paint dried between layers before I proceeded. That's a very important thing to remember for this stage of the technique. So one thing that I learned while working with this black is a little bit will do it. So you'll actually see me struggle a bit when I'm laying over the glaze layers with how thick this black is. So hindsight, I should have thinned it out a little bit more for this and spread it out while I was applying it rather than putting it on quite so heavy. You will see that it's actually particularly problematic when I come back and do the neck. And again, this is a great place to lay down character of your individual. Do they have laugh lines? Do they have frown lines? Do they have wrinkles? Maybe they're a little older. Do they have a particular brightness to their smile? So we're thinking about how the lighting can also provide information about the character of the person that we're depicting here. All right, coming back, adding some heavy white to the individual, letting it dry, filling in the necks. Moving on to the next person. So in this case, we are using our green underpainting. The Verdale technique. So here we are putting down an olive undertone, which is totally fine, a nice, strong, opaque layer. I kind of wish I had gone over it with a yellow. So what you'll see later is I have to do many, many layers of glaze in order to move the tone away from how green this is. So when you're laying down green faces, you know, either be sure that you want to complexion this olive or add a little bit of yellow to make it a sort of greenish yellow instead. So because this face is in profile, we're adding a lot more shadow to that quarter of the face that's sort of turned away from the viewer. We're picking out our cheekbones. In this case, you know, really chiseling it into the jaw because of how the shadows were in the source image. We've got our neck placement. I forgot the jawline here. Maybe I'll come back and do that. I guess we'll find out. So in here, I'm laying down a yellow as my undertone. Hindsight again, I wish I had actually done a little bit of white over that to create a very bright effect for this individual. All right, for the last one, we've created a brown underpainting. I somehow managed to skip the midtone painting. And this individual is from Bombay, and one of the most striking things about her is the sort of purplish shadows of her face. And so, you know, each of these color palettes really brings out different types of ethnicities. So play around. So here we are adding the purple for the shadows. Later I'll add purple for the lips as well as that base. And then for my highlight, I'm coming in with a yellow to create my highlight areas. So a little shadow on the neck. And there we go. We're also going to go ahead and do our beastie. So same rules apply. We're applying our midtone, and then we'll do shadows and highlights. So, but we're thinking about the texture that we're going to go over this animal with. So here I'm doing a raven, and so I'm going to be doing my overpainting as speckles of black and gray. So if you're going to be doing like a furred creature, and you're going to be using very light texture on top of it, you might want to use a darker undertone or vice versa. So be thinking about the color that you want to layer on there, and whether or not you're providing a good base. But here I'm really focused on providing some of the main highlights and lowlights that I want to come through even with the textured painting I'm going to do for the feathers later. And so we've got our highlights added, following the lines of the feather, really emphasizing some of the back of the animal here, and definitely creating a strong shadow between the wing and the body. So picking out some of the most prominent features with a heavy highlight and low light in this level of painting. All right, for this portion, you want to make sure that the paints that you're using have been watered out enough that they are semi-transparent. And so for this case, I've already painted over the first set of leaves. This is the leaf that doesn't have any underpainting whatsoever. And so you can see that this green is a little watery, it's a little see-through, and we would never leave painting like this just by itself. And I mean, that's another reason why underpainting is so great with green, is it actually has sort of spaced out pigment. It's not very strong by itself. And so that lets some of this black and white really shine through. And so you can see I'm applying the glaze to the first leaf, the one with the monochromatic griselle underpainting. And one thing I want to point out is that I am definitely not working that paint around. I'm applying it lightly. I'm applying it in one direction as much as possible. And I'm trying not to disturb the paint that's underneath. So in the process, it's getting a little smoothed out. What was originally very blocky lights and darks are now a little bit blended together, but enough that we can still really see the shapes underneath. Another thing to keep in mind is it's good not to go directly from painting over one of our low light areas to one of our highlight areas, because that's going to sort of muddy the paint and drag it together. So particularly when you're doing the first layer of overpainting on the faces, I really recommend that you sort of paint over, your low lights first and then come back in with your highlights. Let it dry just a tiny bit so that you're not disturbing that lower layer and blending the low lights and the highlights together. So again, we're just putting that glaze on pretty quickly. Strokes in a single direction. We're not applying it very heavy. We just want it sort of nice and even, and some of what's underneath is going to shine through. And in this case, that's exactly what we want. And one of the things I really want you to stop and appreciate is how the colors look different based on what the underpainting is. So with our black and white, we end up with sort of a little bit of a cool palette, but the lights and darks are so striking. Whereas when we do it over the yellow, we get a very sort of subdued warmth to it. We're still definitely seeing our lights and darks, but it's not as strong, but there's an overall feeling of sort of spring and a vibrance to it. This is even more apparent with what we've got going on here with the blue. So in this case, this is almost sort of a wintry looking leaf. It has that cool tone that the blue is providing to it. And if you think about it, that pigment layer back there is working just like a pigment. And so some of the light is coming through the glaze and hitting the pigment at the bottom. And so we're getting both the green light from the glaze layer bouncing back to our eyes where we can see it. We're also getting just a little bit of that blue or white or whatever it is. And so if it's white, it's bouncing back brighter color to us. And if it's dark, we're not getting much light back. And so we're really getting that color depth. So here we're starting on our faces, and I'm using Naples yellow. And like I said before, we are doing the highlight areas first without disturbing the paint so that we can keep these areas pretty distinct. Working hard not to blend the paint together or just sort of, letting it come from the brush. And so that's an example there of just how watered down this is. You can really see the paint through it. We're just applying a very, very thin translucent coat to the top. And as I'm applying my low lights, you'll notice that I'm following the contours of the face. So I'm leaving a tiny bit of a line, along the edge of the cheekbone and around the nose and, between the ears. And so that's creating kind of a subtle but important line between these different features. And so it's softer than if we were just sort of like drawing that on there with ink, but it really kind of tells the eye what's going on. So in the second layer is when I'm following the contours of the face and actually starting to do just a tiny bit of blending between my lowlights and my highlights. I'm still trying to follow the features to keep things fairly well distinct. But this is where things are going to start getting a little bit of that softness. But again, you don't want to do that on the bottom layer. And you still want to make sure that you're mostly following the contours so that we keep that nice cheekbone line. And one of the things you'll notice is that, we're applying a brighter glaze on top of a darker background. And so, really what had initially been kind of a dauntingly dark backdrop is now taking on kind of a vibrant color. So I've got a little bit more blending going on this layer, but again, still following the features, keeping things fairly distinct. As I've noticed that I've got some brush marks sort of obscuring the features, I'll draw along it to sharpen that back up. So here we're using a different color than we will for the rest of the faces. So we're using a watered down warm brown that I will show you at some point. And again, we're making sure to pick out the highlights first before coming back to our midtones and our dark tones, because we don't want to get things to be blended together too soon. That will definitely lose the contours of the face. So you can see I'm starting to have a little bit of trouble with that black. It's coming off on the brush really bad. So, be a little bit more sparing if you're using black as your low light. It will definitely darken things up a lot more than you're expecting. So I'm washing off my brush to make sure I'm not transferring that to the painting again. And that's how thin that brown is right there. It's very transparent. So the color tonality is really coming from that underlayer. Yeah, this is an exercise in futility. You'll notice at some point I just come back with a big thick glob of brown paint and just, no, I'm trying to work it off. That's not going to work. All right, so here you can tell that I'm blending the shadows of the nose and the eyes out a little bit. This is where I'm trying to smooth out the features a little bit and give it a more unified look. Pulling the paint off when I realize I've put too much on, wiping it off, coming back. So again, I'm using a thin glaze, but I want to make sure that I'm not applying too much. And I definitely don't want my brush to be too dry, because then I'm going to get a lot more blending. So in this case, I'm using a really nice brush, and that helps a lot with this technique. Something that'll hold paint, but not tend to glop on you. Yeah, there I'm coming back with a big glop of paint. I'm just fed up with that neck. Cleaning up the jawline. All right. And so this one, I had to do so many layers that I just had to come back and speed the video up two times. Otherwise, we'd be here all day. So again, learn from my mistakes. Unless you are working with a sort of browner complexion, you probably want to add a little bit of yellow to your green so that you're not starting off so far away from your desired color. Otherwise, it'll take you a lot of layers to get there. So one of the other things you'll notice about this particular face with the green background is that the more layers I do, the sort of smaller the surface area that I'm working with gets. Currently I'm blending it in, I'm encompassing the whole face, but you'll notice that I start building up onto my sort of raised features, the cheeks, the nose, the bottom of the jaw, and that creates a sort of really nice blending into the green to create the contrast for the features. And I'm having to let it dry after each layer, thus the video cuttings out. So this ended up taking me longer than I wanted it to. Even though I am definitely applying the paint in a very fast, just focused sort of way. So again, you can see that cheek with the yellow overpainting very quickly achieved a sort of tone close to what I was looking for. I am cutting in the jaw, cleaning that up. But I'm really having to work it in, especially on the lower part of the face. Lots more layers. But you'll notice that I'm starting to, not apply it as close to the nose. I'm sort of building up my glaze where I want the most brightness in the face. And every time it dries, it gets a little bit darker and greener, and I have to go back again. But I definitely think that the final result is definitely worth it. But you can tell I'm getting into it because there's my head in front of the camera. And just to emphasize, the color I'm using here is exactly the same as the color I was using on the far left. So here I'm taking basically the same Naples yellow with a tiny bit of pink worked into it. And I'm using it on my cheeks, my forehead, the areas that are sort of the brightest. So this is brightening it up, but it's also adding in some of the ruddiness of the complexion of this particular person. So now I'm coming back in with a pretty bright pink, and I'm just hitting the cheeks and giving it that apple of the cheek flush. It's a nice effect for this person here. All right, so this is again the same Naples yellow, very similar brown tone as the face on the left, but here we've got purple worked into it, and we'll also add more layers to brighten it up more than we do the face on the left. So it's kind of a nice contrast piece. So here I am, again, I'm just hitting the highlights. I don't want to blend it too much, and then I'll come back for the low lights here in a bit. That's my next application. Now again, this purple is very heavily tinted, similar to the black on the second face. So you'll watch me have to blend it and cover it over quite a bit. I've got a little bit of dark on my brush, which I used to pick out the temples, and the bow of the lips and the jaw there. And then it'll be build, build, build. So here I had too much of my brush, stopped, dabbed it off before I went on to apply my pigment. And yes, the first layer is going to look like crap. But, stick with it. Add your glaze. You'll be able to blend a little bit on your second layer and a lot more on your third layer, and that's going to help a lot. So there I'm picking out the temple, adding some shape to the face. Leaving a little bit of purple on the very edges of the nose so that we get that contrast for that feature, so we can make it out. Letting it dry between the layers, coming back, and I'm applying it pretty heavily on this purple, and that's just fine. wiping off my brush so I'm not dragging purple into my highlight areas. Just be very cognizant of that, particularly when you notice that the glaze color is changing based on where you've been applying. So there I am picking out the shape of the nose a little bit, really working that cheek to be the shape that I want it to be. Blending the shadow along the jaw a little bit more. So we're getting much closer to our final product here, but wanted to add a couple of more layers of glaze, and you'll see the difference it makes. Because we're still getting very heavy shadows from that purple. Again, with your dark colors, you don't want to be as heavy with it as I was for this demonstration. That's me trying to fill in the lips. Cute! They're still purple. Alright, so because of the purple, I'm pretty much just laying some glaze over the shapes, the shadows of the eye, blending it in just a little bit, and out, I should say. And using it to define the edge of the nose again and the bottom of the cheekbones. Oh, did not like that shape of the nose. Yep, it's still purple. So the amount of glaze that you add to it is really based on your level of preference and what it is that you're looking for. I could have stopped sooner, but I wanted a more natural effect. I also find I tend to futz more with the female faces than the male faces. Alright, now we're doing our beastie. So as I mentioned here, I really want a very textured application of the glaze layer. So I'm actually adding tiny little dots, like speckled feathers. So I'm doing that around the wing. I'm working it in a tiny bit, so it's blending a little bit with the underlayer, but not too bad. I want it to really still maintain a very textured appearance. This is based on some examples that I've seen for like fabrics and other sorts of surfaces using this technique by the different Renaissance masters. So I asked myself, well, why not do it for, feathers or fur? And it works, it's a much better textured application that still has a good opaque color than some of the other things. So here I am, I'm adding a gray into some of the areas that are going to be a little brighter on the bird, the belly, and a little bit on the sort of very top of the wing, like the shoulder. And then what I'll do is I'll go back and I'll pick out the pin feathers and the tail feathers to get that nice shape that I want it to be. Picking out the toes, the shadow of the wing, making sure I've got a good shadow on the belly as well. Adding a little bit of hand-painted texture, darkness on the beak, that sort of thing. So I've gone over to kind of fix some of the details after the textured application. And when you look at the final image of the Yeah, this part's upside down. When you look at the final image of the faces as well, you can see I went back and in some cases picked out the features a little bit more, fixed up the eyes, the hair. All of those things make a big difference. So here I am, I'm adding a little bit of white texture for my main highlights, very lightly applied, and but it still builds on that textured base that we created with our overpainting. So yeah, not a bad looking beastie. Coming back in with the white, very dry sort of light application to get a strong contrasted color. Maybe too dry.